I want to welcome you all to another installment of Acquiring Aquinas. What we do in this series is we break down each article of the Summa into its fundamental argument so that we can look at arguments for and against each position. This will give us an overall sense of the flow of Aquinas' thought as well as the large scope that the Summa covers. Today we're looking at the article question, whether God is the object of sacred doctrine. Now, the larger context that we're looking at this article in is still in question 1 of the Summa, which is the nature and extent of sacred doctrine. The answer that Aquinas gives to this particular article about whether God is the object of the science is that yes, indeed, God is the object of sacred doctrine. Now, this might seem strange, sort of a strange question considering the high value that Aquinas places on sacred doctrine. Now, remember, in the last article, Aquinas argues that sacred doctrine is indeed wisdom, and remember, wisdom is a superlative title that was originally reserved for metaphysics as presented by Aristotle. But there's 2 reasons why some may think that God is not the object of sacred doctrine, even if it has such a noble status. The first is that God, it is argued, can at best be only known indirectly by us, so there's not a real clear or direct sense of God as the object of the science. So something else would have to be used instead of this. The second reason is because the unity of the science of sacred doctrine lacks enough unity, it is argued, to be able to say that God is the object of the science. The unity of the science through its formal object of study is key for its identity as a science, so since theology is science, there must be found some formal object that also makes sense as an alternative to God being the object of the science. So as always, we'll look at objections to the claim that Aquinas is making that God is the object of sacred doctrine. The first objection, major premise, the object of sacred doctrine is a presupposed essence. The minor premise, God is not a presupposed essence, and so conclusion, thus God is not the object of sacred doctrine, and that contradicts Aquinas' answer. Now, support for the major premise can be given here by Aquinas. So specifically, as a science, sacred doctrine has the requirement that its essence of study be the object of the science, and that it be presupposed. For example, in order for biological organisms to be the object of biology, one needs to know what biological organisms are at an essential level. Another way of thinking about the essence of something, whether it be a thing or the object of the science itself, is to be able to provide a definition for them. This is because knowing the essence of something at some level allows us to think consistently about the same things, so we can make progress in knowing more and more truths within that science. Now, the minor premise is that God is not a presupposed essence. Presupposed, of course, meaning presupposed in our knowledge. And so support for this minor premise is given that a common claim is that we do not know the essence of God in this life because of God's infinite nature and his status as being outside of the created order. As this idea goes, all knowledge comes through the senses. And so since all essences are obtained in our knowledge through abstraction from perception, God's essence cannot be known by us. At best, it can only be known indirectly or negatively or in some such manner. Thus, it would seem to follow that God cannot be the object of sacred doctrine. Moving on to the second objection to the conclusion. Major premise, no object about which there are scientific conclusions narrower than what is reached in the science of sacred doctrine is the object of sacred doctrine. Minor premise, God is an object about which there are scientific conclusions narrower than what is reached in the science of sacred doctrine. Thus, God is not the object of sacred doctrine, and this contradicts Aquinas' answer. Regarding the major premise, note that there is some change of language here, which I included to make it more descriptive. In the objection, Aquinas refers to something being, quote, comprehended under the object of the science. The idea here is that conclusions in a science arguably are conclusions about the objects of the science, which isn't true when thinking about God and conclusions that populate sacred doctrine. So I made this idea more explicit by talking about the scope of the conclusions relative to the object of the science, identifying the objection that conclusions of a science must not be broader than conclusions about the object of the science. This lends some support to why someone might hold this claim to be true in a way perhaps more evident than merely talking about conclusions being comprehended in the object. At least that's what I thought. I think the idea here specifically is that the scope and concern of the science is determined by the object, which is the focus of the investigation in an essential way, that is to say, comprehended within it, rather than accidentally to that particular focus. Now, in terms of the minor premise, that God is an object about which there are scientific conclusions narrower than what is reached in the science of sacred doctrine. What is comprehended in divine science is not only conclusions about God, but also about God's creatures. For example, conclusions about human morality is comprehended within sacred doctrine, which is broader than conclusions about God. Thus, it would seem that creatures only have an accidental relationship to God, and so outside of what should be the focus of God as the object of sacred doctrine, and so it would follow that God is not the object of sacred doctrine. Now on to the on the contrary, or the orienting argument. So the argument goes like this. Major premise, that which sacred doctrine principally treats is the object of sacred doctrine. Minor premise, God is that which sacred doctrine principally treats, thus God is the object of sacred doctrine. Now support for the major premise is actually very simple, and that is that the object of sacred doctrine is just identified with what is studied in the discipline. That's a fairly straightforward premise. Now in terms of the minor premise, that God is that which sacred doctrine principally treats, the authority cited in this case is the very name of the discipline, namely theology, which is literally the study of God. That sacred doctrine is also called theology is a very common accepted name for the discipline. Now let's look at Aquinas' major argument in favor of his position that God is the object of sacred doctrine. The major premise, the aspect under which all things are referred to as science, is the object of sacred doctrine. God is the aspect under which all things are referred to as science. Thus, God is the object of sacred doctrine. Now, in terms of the major premise, we can think of it this way. We need to think about the relation between a science and its object in order to get at the idea about the object of sacred doctrine itself. The object is like a relation between the things studied in a science and the conclusions of the science itself. This relation is the formal aspect under which the various things in the science are related to the science as a whole. Aquinas says that this relation is the same as that between a habit or faculty and its object. Now this is kind of uncommon language that we might not be used to, so let's take an example. So take the example of the faculty or the operation of sight and the object of sight. The things seen are referred to the faculty of sight by being brought under the aspect of being colored, as stones are seen insofar as they are colored. So with sacred doctrine, the object is the aspect under which the things understood are referred to the conclusions of the science. This undermines the claim that the object of this science cannot be God, because it is either of things and signs, works of salvation, or the whole Christ as the head and member, as it is claimed. These all can be included, as a matter of fact, just under the aspect as they have reference to God. The minor premise that God is the aspect under which all things are referred to as science, we think of this in terms of sacred science itself, that all things are treated of under the aspect of God, either because they are God himself or because they refer to God as their beginning and end. Hence it follows that God is indeed the object of this science. Now there's a second argument that we can see at work in this article as well. The major premise is the object of the principles of the science is the object of sacred doctrine. Minor premise, God is the object of the principles of the science. Thus, God is the object of sacred doctrine. So the language that's really being used to couch this idea is this idea of knowing things through their principles. So in terms of support for the major premise, that the object of the principles of the science is the object of sacred doctrine, he says that the object of the principles in the whole science must be the same, since the whole science is contained virtually in its principles. The principles can be understood as the prior intelligible conditions that are to be sought, and from which propositional conclusions of the science follow. In this regard, the principles of sacred doctrine are the articles of faith, and so the object of the articles of faith will be one and the same as the object of the science. Now, it follows from the minor premise that God is indeed the object of the principles of the science. The object of the principles of sacred doctrine are, of course, God, since faith itself is about God, faith being knowledge and belief in God. Thus, it follows that God is the object of sacred doctrine. So let's see which of the premises in the main objection arguments Aquinas takes issue with. So in this first objection, he takes issue with the major premise, which is the object of sacred doctrine is a presupposed essence. He instead opts for the contrary to this claim, namely that the object of sacred doctrine is not a presupposed essence. Now, it is admitted that we cannot know the essence of God in its essence. Aquinas holds this view with regard to this life. However, this is not necessary in order to have God as the object of the science, since the aspect on which refers things to the conclusions of sacred doctrine can function by way of God's effects instead of a proper definition. This method is not unique to sacred doctrine, but to other philosophical sciences, in which demonstration proceeds from effect to cause, in which the effect is taken in place of a definition of the cause. For example, Aquinas will argue that we must hold through sound argumentation that there is a first efficient cause and that all humans call this God. So this method is of course laid out by Aristotle in the Posterior Analytics. Now to the second objection argument. The premise that Aquinas thinks is false is the minor premise, which was God is an entity about which there are scientific conclusions narrower than what is reached in the science of sacred doctrine. And he holds instead that God is not an entity about which there are scientific conclusions narrower than what is reached in the science of sacred doctrine. Specifically, he thinks that a key idea in this claim is what is meant by God. By God is not meant just the summit of all being, but rather the aspect that brings unity and comprehension to the various things related to sacred doctrine. So in this way, conclusions in sacred doctrine can be about things other than God, but understood as they relate in a fundamental way to God.